Greetings and welcome to the Anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences. My name is Uzma Rizvi and I'm Associate Professor of Anthropology and Urban Studies at Pratt Institute. In my role as chair of the board of the Anthropology section, New York Academy of Sciences, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us from all the various places and times you may be from. Let me stop this share here. We are excited this evening in New York City to present as a part of our 2020-2021 programming on reimagining resilience, a conversation between Patricia Ayala and Janet Chernela. This conversation, entitled Indigenous Rights, Territory, and Advocacy, Anthropology's Colonial Legacy and Contemporary Vocation, is an important one that we've, as a board, been thinking quite a bit about in terms of what are the many different factors that are part of this sort of conversation. Now, prior to COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic hitting our different communities, notions of nationalistic xenophobia, neoliberal policies of extraction, and social policies of exclusion had permeated continental landscapes in the Americas. Tied to these policies and politics, indigenous rights and territory have played a central role in anthropology since the invention of the discipline. A foundational relationship made even more apparent as a result of the recent developments in Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, and the United States, among many other countries. Like, we can see this actually globally. Recent conflicts and continuing struggles surrounding land rights point to the complex role of anthropological advocacy and indigenous belonging in our current global context. Drawing from the past and the present, anthropologists featured on this panel look to engage these topics in our ever-changing cultural, political landscape, issues made even more urgent during the present pandemic crisis and the ever-expanding authoritarian, anti-scientific forms of governance, which we all are experiencing in many different ways around the world. Of course, to ensure all of this kind of programming can happen, we rely on grants and sponsors. And so I'd like to take an opportunity to acknowledge the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research and Bergen Books for supporting the Anthropology section. Equally significant, if not more constant, is the Board of Advisors for our section. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the many hours of work done by our board at these events. I particularly wanted to thank board members, Vice Chair Matt Riley, our Treasurer Ryan Rome, and our Anthropology section fellows, Anna Sergeva and Miriam Leitner. Without all of them, none of this would be possible. I'd like to now turn to introduce two remarkable scholars, creative thinkers, and women who have shown through their work how to be responsible, rigorous academic and person in the world. Patricia Ayala has focused her research in Chile on the power relations between indigenous people, archaeologists, and the state, patrimonialization processes, collaborative methodologies, and disciplinary ethics. Patricia, I invite you to join us, so feel free to turn on your camera. Welcome. In Chile, Dr. Ayala was a coordinator of public relations between the Atacamenos people and the Archaeological Research Institute and the Museum of the Universidad Católica del Norte, where she worked as an academic. She has taught at the College of the Atlantic in the United States and Universidad de Chile, the Universidad Católica del Norte, and the Universidad Católica del Temuco in Chile, as well as at the Universidad de Buenos Aires in Argentina. She has worked as a research consultant for the Abe Museum, I think that's how we pronounce it, and the Australian National University in Australia. Patricia has made important contributions in the theoretical field and disciplinary reflections of archaeology and anthropology, which have been published in various journals and books. At the moment, her research is focused on different issues of cultural heritage, especially those related to repatriation and reburial of indigenous human remains. Currently, she's working as a freelance research consultant and has an honorary position at the Museum of Ethnography in La Paz, Bolivia. Welcome, Patricia. Janet Chernela is professor of anthropology at the University of Maryland. Janet, I'd encourage you to join us now. Welcome. She received her PhD with distinction from Columbia University in 1983 and has conducted field research in the Brazilian Amazon since 1978. Dr. Chernela is author of the book A Sense of Space, the Wanano Indians of the Brazilian Amazon, and numerous articles including Language, Ideology, and Women's Speech, Talking Community in the Northwest Amazon, and this, many of you must be familiar with it, it's in the American Anthropologist, and then one from the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology, which is quite related, The Second World, a Wanano Woman, Truth, Lies, and Backtalk in the Brazilian Northwest Amazon. She has served as president of the Society for the Anthropology of Lowland South America, chair of the Committee for Human Rights of the American Anthropological Association, and is the founder of the Association for Women of the Upper Rio Negro, the first Amerindian women's association in Brazil and its oldest ongoing indigenous organization. So welcome, Janet. It's a pleasure to have both of you here. Our moderator for this evening is Hugo Benavides. Again, as always, an honor for me to have Hugo here, as I've known and followed his work for over 2 decades. I've been honored to call him a mentor, a colleague, a friend, a neighbor, and a fellow board member of the New York Academy of Sciences Anthropology section. And as of last week, an elder. We decided that we need to begin to have elders within anthropology. And so Hugo is now one of my elders. This evening's program came from a deep commitment and engagement by Hugo. And so for that work and for everything else that you're doing, Hugo, thank you very much. Professor of Anthropology, Latin American and Latino Studies, and International Political Economy and Development at Fordham University, as well as chair of the Sociology and Anthropology Department. Benavides is also the founding director of the Strategic Research Consortium on Global Studies and the Liberal Arts Program at Fordham's London Centre at Kensington. His research has been supported by grants from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, National Science Foundation, Wenner Gren Foundation, Social Science Research Council, and the Andrew Mellon Foundation. His initial interest in the past provided him an extensive archaeological practice, excavating both Inca sites in the Andes and the Roman site of Pompeii in Italy. Before I hand this off to our moderator, Hugo, I wanted to let all of you know, our audience know, that we'll be live tweeting during this event at NYAS_ANTH, that's ANTH. So if you are so inclined, please do join the conversation there. And to become part of our growing community, you can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram, the same handle at NYAS_ANTH. You can like us on Facebook, you can join our listserv and become part of our vibrant community of anthropologists. Finally, throughout the course of this webinar, you can post questions in the Q&A section on the lower bar of your Zoom menu. We are also, if you are on YouTube watching this live stream, there is a comment section, so feel free to post your questions there. We will be culling questions from these areas. We'll collect as many questions as we can throughout the program and hope to get to as many of them as possible throughout the course of the panel. In case of a breach of security, we have a secondary Zoom ready. It'll take about 10 minutes to relaunch. So if something happens, we will shut the webinar down, and within 10 minutes, there's an automatic email that will be sent to you as you are watching, and we will show you the direction to the secondary space, the different webinar. So with that, please join me in welcoming Janet Chernela, Patricia Ayala, and our moderator, Hugo Benavides, for the conversation, Indigenous Rights, Territory, and Advocacy, Anthropology's Colonial Legacy and Contemporary Vocation. Thank you so much. Give it to you.
Thank you, Uzma. I'm not that old. That's the only thing I want to say. So thanks again, Uzma, and welcome to all, and particularly welcome to Patricia and Janet. It really is a great pleasure to be with both of you tonight. I think we're incredibly lucky, and I really look forward, as I know both of you do as well, to have a really wonderful and, I would say, enlightening conversation where we could all participate and all learn from each other. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I know that both of you are as well. And it's actually true. This has been a long time coming. We've thought about this for many months, I would say the whole year. So it's really wonderful that both of you said yes, which you are our top picks. So really looking forward to tonight. I'd like to make just a couple of points before we start. And the first one is actually just to extend once again that welcome, because I think we are really lucky and privileged to have both of you. Between both of you, we have decades. And again, we're not that old. We're just really, really wonderfully talented. But decades of work, and above all, I would say generous commitment to the communities in the Brazilian Amazon, but also in the Southern Andes, particularly in Bolivia and Chile. So there's a wealth of knowledge, there's a wealth of experience that I think will really allow us today to learn from, but also to do some historical reckoning with the processes of colonialism and neocolonialism that still affect many of our ancestral communities. I also want to be sure to recognize, particularly on this panel, the ancestral communities that once were I don't want to say owners of the lands, but that had access and rights to these lands before us, which are the Lenape, and what the island of Manahara and all the territories and islands around it were called Lenape Hoking, which I'm sure I'm destroying and distorting with a horrible accent, but to translate the land of the Lenape. But another point I want to make, and it's equally as important as recognizing the ancestral homelands, is the fact that what I just did is also a sign of collusion. And I want to sort of recognize that, right? It doesn't by any way relieve me or us of the fact of the genocide and ethnocide that were committed against these ancestral communities, but actually it's a recognition that my ancestors and my descendants and the descendants of my ancestors actually did that to theirs. And that's exactly, I think, one of the issues that we want to discuss today, which is really the dismembering and the remembering of histories, right? And the questions that come up with that, in the sense of who gets to tell the stories, whose and what stories get told, who listens to the stories and who doesn't listen to what is said, and ultimately, what defines the authoritative powers that sustain the stories, particularly for, I would say, such a compromised discipline as anthropology is. And finally, before I give the words to both Janet and Patricia, I also want to take this moment and offer, in some ways, this conversation, this panel dedicated to the memory of one of my mentors, Professor Warren DeBoer, who passed several months ago. And I just want to recognize that because I moved to New York City 30 years ago to work with him. And I want to publicly recognize and appreciate all that he was able to instill in me, particularly a commitment to scholarship, to evidential truth, and not more than that, but equally to that, an incredible dry sense of humor and wit. And for that, I am grateful. And I hope he is with the ancestors tonight. And with that, we're going to move on to the conversation. We decided on the following model or structure. Each of the panelists, first Janet, then Patricia, will have around 10 minutes to initiate the conversation, telling us a little bit about their experience, about their work, and how they enter into the work and particularly into the collaboration we want to do tonight. After each of them have their say, and I would say it'll take around 10 minutes or so each, I will ask both of them two questions. And my hope is to have those questions actually spark a wider conversation with the audience. And if you do have questions or comments, please just submit those and they will come to us and we'll try to feel them as they come along. And our hope actually is to have and be able to feel all the questions, or at least as many as possible. So that's the way we decided to do this in the most collaborative way possible. And we will hope, I think, to stay with the language of English as much as possible. But we might switch to another European language or two other European language of Spanish and Portuguese because we may need to, and particularly even more wonderfully, their transition languages of Spanglish and Portañol. So we will do the best we can in the linguistic mode best for the moment. So with that said, I'll pass it to Janet. And do you want to take it from here, Janet? And then Patricia after that. You have to unmute yourself, Janet. Yeah.
Thank you, Hugo. First, let me give a very heartfelt thank to the very amicable group at the New York Academy of Sciences, particularly Uzma, Matthew, and Hugo. This has been an extremely pleasurable experience working with you. Thank you very much. And since you mentioned Warren de Boer, who was a friend of mine, I thought I would just mention three names of Indigenous peoples who passed away during the COVID crisis: Payakan Kayapo, Messias Kokama, and Aritana Yoalapiti. Can you see the slides? Can you see a single slide?
It's not shared yet.
It's not shared yet.
No. Now it is.
Okay, thank you. Well, I began to work in the Brazilian Amazon in 1978, not knowing really much about Brazil at all. My goal was to work in what is called the Northwest Amazon along the Brazilian-Colombian border, because as a graduate student, I was very impressed by the ethnography written by Irving Goldman. It was an interesting time in Brazil. It was the middle of the military dictatorship. Is there a reason why this is not going forward? Oh, yes. Sorry. Excuse me. Are we going?
Yeah, now it's just going continuously.
How do I get back? Previous. So this is actually me in the Northwest Amazon, in the village where I happily did field work. Brazil at the time had a national policy of integration of indigenous peoples. It had recently passed something called the Statute of the Indian Statute, so-called, in which it was said that Indians had to be the wards of the state, and would be so until they were fully assimilated. In the role of full assimilation in the Northwest Amazon, the Salesian mission played a significant role. And I selected this slide to show you that the mission center was unusual among other centers in that it considered its role to be principally apostolic. You know, since Vatican II, that was done away with for the most part, but apostolic practices continued in some places, including the Northwest Amazon, where, as you see here, the bishop is converting 3,000 semi-nomadic hupta together. The location of the assimilation practices in the Northwest Amazon largely occurred in the boarding schools of the Salesian mission. And here you can see a class. This picture is not one that I took. It was taken during the 50s. But during my visit, the situation was very much the same. These boarding schools were compulsory. In them, the children were taught Portuguese. They were not permitted to speak indigenous languages. They were taught reading and writing and arithmetic, but the girls were also taught domestic practices. Here you see them actually cleaning moss from the stones outside the mission. During the time that I came to know people, they asked me to visit their families in Manaus. And so when I went on R&R, I had with me the addresses of family members living in Manaus. I discovered that they were all young women working in the homes of military families. Unfortunately, they were not paid. And an investigation into this proved that there were some 209 speakers who could give testimony to this, and a fellow anthropologist by the name of Leonardo Figoli worked on that very subject. Together with two friends of mine, one was actually a Silesian himself, and the other was a human rights worker. We wrote up a case for the Fourth Russell Tribunal. That case was delivered by Alvaro Sampaio, who had his own testimony, his own experiences with this very process. You can see Alvaro then and Alvaro now. He has indeed become a statesman. The tribunal was extremely successful. Among the changes that occurred as a result of the tribunal, and many of these were due to the cooperation from other Silesian missionaries elsewhere in Brazil, was that the mission itself was converted from the principal role of a conversion center, an apostolic vicariate, as it's called, to a parish or a diocese, where the local persons administer the congregation and are the pastors. The boarding school was closed. The maid trade was stopped, and the women at the center of the case created what Uzma already described as the first registered Indigenous women's organization in Brazil. That organization, APMARN, Associação de Mulheres do Alto Rio Negro, still exists. The women now have a crafts center. They have a house. They sell crafts in the city and in the house. They have meetings every week. Here I am with 3 generations of members. Anna, who is to my left, is the mother of Carlota, who's to my right, and Juina is to Anna's left. She is Anna's granddaughter. That is how the organization continues and how it continues to change to this day. The second case that I wanted to bring to your attention is one that took place 8 years later. And this one involves NGOs, the United States Congress, and the World Bank. The story begins in 1988 when I was a professor at Florida International University and had just returned from 7 years living in Brazil. I participated in the preparation of a conference on tropical rainforests. And to that conference, I invited 2 Kayapo, Payakan and Kubayin, as well as the anthropologist Daryl Posey. Here you see some of the participants in that conference. And here you see Payakan, who unfortunately just passed away at the same conference. At that time, criticism of the World Bank was internationally roaring. People were specifically aiming their criticism at the impacts of the World Bank on the environments of tropical and third world nations. Some of the members who were present at that conference were representatives of NGOs who were working on this very campaign. One of them is Bruce Rich, who's photo you see here and whose article and book you see here. These representatives of NGOs were aware of a proposal placed by the nation of Brazil before the World Bank for a very large hydroelectrical plant, which today is called Belo Monte. It would be placed on the Xingu River, and it would impact the villages of several indigenous peoples, including the Kayapo, the very group that Payakan and Kubaying were from. Yet they knew nothing about it. And here you can see how the Kayapo villages are placed right along the Xingu River itself. The dam would both cause the Xingu River to dry up during certain seasons and also cause flooding in other seasons. Right now, it has affected the fish supply, but we'll get to the current situation in a moment. The members of the NGOs decided that upon discovering that the Kayapo had no knowledge of this proposal, decided to bring Payakan to Washington, D.C., where he could testify about the lack of compliance by the Electro Norte, the entity that would construct the dam, in consulting with indigenous peoples to be affected by it. The Kayapo gave press conferences. They met with the U.S. Treasury Department. They met with the Senate Appropriations Committee, and they testified at the World Bank. Part of the success of this strategy was that the Senate Appropriations Committee had their own concerns with the World Bank. As a result of Payakan's testimony, 4 of the 7 executive directors voted against the proposal. This apparently had never happened before, according to some reports. Usually, things simply went through with a rubber stamp, an automatic approval. But in this case, Payakan was so successful that he persuaded 4 of the executive directors of the World Bank to vote against it. The outcomes of these events were quite stunning. The World Bank attended to its environmental guidelines. It created an environmental department. And although this event alone didn't persuade the World Bank to go into these changes, these structural changes, it was part of the many different political activities that did pressure the bank into taking these steps. And in the following year, there was a great celebration in Altamira. I point out that in this picture, you can see the kind of alliance making that an occasion like this provided. Here you see Sting, of course. Payakan is in the middle, and to Payakan's right is Hayuni. By that time, Brazil was in the process of creating a new constitution, and indigenous peoples played a very active role in that constitutional assembly. The new constitution was quite powerful. It was quite strong. It considered indigenous rights to be original rights. It guaranteed the rights of indigenous peoples over their lands, over the soil, rivers, and lakes. And it considered these rights to be inalienable and non-transferable. Perhaps in the rest of our conversation today, we can return to some of these points. When I first started to work, there were no lands that were demarcated in Brazil. In fact, I made a trip talking about demarcation with indigenous peoples in 1978. And it was quite a new idea to them. But today, there are fully 690 federally recognized indigenous territories. There are many more in the process. And of course, Bolsonaro is not furthering that process in any way. And we should come back to that as well. We can talk about all of these things later. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. And yes, there's a lot already of topics on the table, so I appreciate that presentation. Thank you. Patricia, do you want to go next?
Ok, gracias, Hugo. Primero que nada, quiero saludar al pueblo atacameño, con quienes trabajo hace muchos años, y también quiero saludar a la tribu Passamaquoddy, ya que actualmente me encuentro en su territorio. Tonight, I'm going to talk about indigenous rights, mining industry, and archaeology in Atacamenos territory. I'm going to give a brief introduction about the indigenous rights in Chile. In this presentation, I focus on the cultural and territorial rights and struggles of the Atacamenos people, starting from the premise that their demands for territory and water cannot be separated from those linked to the bodies of their ancestors. I do this in order to foster our collaborative discussion on the many important issues surrounding indigenous rights, territories, and advocacy. The ancestral territory of the Atacamenos is located within what is now Antofagasta region in northern Chile. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Atacamenos people became the workforce of the mining industry, which resulted in their migration to the urban industrial centers of Calama and Antofagasta. Some Atacamenos remained in their traditional territories in the Loa Basin or the Salar de Atacama, where they continue their agropastoral activities or intensify their artisanal mining of salt or yareta, or join the local sulfur industry. They also live in the towns of cities in the southwest of Bolivia, also in the northwest of Argentina. At the present, beside mining and associated jobs, another source of income is the tourist industry that attracted a strong migration to San Pedro Atacama, that is the main town of the Atacamenos. Since this territory was annexed to Chile at the end of the 19th century, the indigenous populations have been subject to a process of ethnic, legal, and political assimilation. During the first half of the 20th century, very little change occurred in favor to the rights of this population. Something different happened with the study of Atacamenos territory and its people, since expeditions of geographers, travelers, and antiquity hunters started their investigations few years after the integration of this region in the Chilean state. Around the same time that the copper mining expanded with the opening of the Chuquicamata mine, one of the biggest mines in the world, archaeological and ethnographic studies began with the arrival of foreign researchers at the beginning of the 20th century. Also, the first law of national monuments was enacted in 1925, starting the process of patrimonialization of indigenous memories, bodies, and material culture. During this century, both mining and aquifer extractivism and the extractivism of indigenous knowledge, bodies, and artifacts will be consolidated in Atacamenos territory. An important milestone in this process is the arrival of archaeologist and priest Gustavo Lepage in 1950s, one of the greatest collectors of indigenous bodies in San Pedro Atacama, since he managed to accumulate a collection of around 5,000 schools in 30 years of research in this territory. At the same time, other archaeologists, national and foreign, dug several funerary sites in Atacamenos territory. Engineers and workers from the Chuquicamata mine also excavated indigenous cemeteries. By 1953, the state developed in Chile the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which assumed responsibility for the state indigenismo. In the beginning of the 1970s, under the socialist government, the country's first indigenous law and the new law of national monuments were enacted. In accordance to the monument law, since then, the indigenous bodies exhumed at archaeological sites are national monuments owned by the state. During the subsequent dictatorship, indigenous issues were reduced to notions of private property and new institutions were created. These changes mean that indigenous people were no longer considered the owners of and adjudicators of over their lands. In 1979, a decree law dissolved the welfare state. Instead, the market emerged as the determining factor in water allocation and configuration of property. The consequences of this law in the indigenous people were devastating and are considered today, until today, the ethnocide legislation of the military regime. Under the dictatorship government and the deepening of the neoliberalism, national water resources were privatized. Under the Water Code and its intersection with Mining Code encouraged foreign investment, resource extraction. In northern Chile, this meant increasing capital interest in copper and later brine extraction, coupled with interest in the accumulation of rights to extract water to process the minerals. During these years, Minera Escondida and Compañía Minera Saldívar began extraction of copper and associated water rights accumulated in the Salar de Atacama. Added to this was the advent of lithium mining through the Chilean Lithium Society and the Chemical Mining Association of Chile. In 1990s, we saw the state's intense deployment of indigenous and heritage politics and the incorporation of a global stakeholders from the transnational mining and tourist sector in the Salar de Atacama. At that time, the Chilean copper boom had led to the heaviest mining investment in the century anywhere, which increased domestic production of this metal threefold. The tremendous importance of the copper mining to the national economy produced some of the greatest social, economical, cultural, and environmental impact on the 20th century in the Atacamenos communities and their territory. Indigenous law was passed in 1993 under the establishment of the neoliberal multiculturalist policies in the country. Unfortunately, this law did not recognize indigenous population under the category of people, which weakened the legal scope of indigenous territorial claims. In addition, this law is subordinated to the water and mining laws, which produce a coexistence of heterogeneous and contradictory laws, which is detrimental to indigenous rights. Despite this problem, the enactment of indigenous law in 1993 and the environmental law in 1994 helped draw attention to historical conflicts between mining companies and the indigenous population over water and rights lands. Considered by many to be the necessary ingredient in the race towards progress and social welfare, mining was both contested and negotiated by indigenous communities in the Atacama region. An example of this defense of water and the opposition of the Atacamenos communities was the Pampa Colorada project of transnational Minera Escondida, which considered the extraction of more than 1,000 liters of water per second. Another project was a geothermal exploration project of a national transnational consortium whose impact on the geyser of Tatio generated a strong opposition from indigenous and non-indigenous communities that transcended internationally. In the south of Atacamenos territory, current reports declare that the hydrological balance of the salar indicates that more refreshed water is extracted that can be naturally replenished. In this context, Atacamenos communities have expressed their resistance to the new mining project and a strong opposition against the growth of exciting mines. as ever more extraction production begins to appear in their territory. Some communities have decided to negotiate with the mining companies, hoping at least to obtain some benefits. On the other hand, the history of scientific extractivism and the over-excavation, collecting, and accumulation of indigenous bodies and materials led the Atacamenos to demand their cultural rights and request to stop the excavation of cemeteries and the exhibition of human bodies. They also demanded respect for their beliefs associated with their ancestors, whom they'll call abuelos o gentiles. The abuelos o gentiles coexist with the contemporary communities in the Atacamenos territory. They are physically present in archaeological cemeteries as non-human entities in streams, springs, and mountains. Abuelos o gentiles inhabit the territory and maintain a relationship with the living. So we could speak of body territories or cuerpos territorios as proposed by Karina Joffre and Nadia Gomez for the Huarpe communities. Archaeology uprooted the abuelos o gentiles from their territories to deposit them in museums in a colonizing and patrimonializing act of indigenous memories and bodies. The relationship between body territory was broken, discontinued, and later denied in the reclassification of these bodies as subjects without identity and belonging to archaeological cultures with no apparent link with the contemporary indigenous people. Recognizing this modern, scientific, archaeological, classifying, and collecting act as a disappearing act is both an act of justice and an act of decolonizing of this discipline. In addition to the imposition of modernity and the capitalist economy, rather than a complete interruption to the Atacamenos' access to their territory, the beginning of industrial extraction meant the imposition of new uses, boundaries, interpretation of the environment, and names of landscapes and features. The beginning of archaeology also changed the relation of the Atacamenos with their territory, not only by excavating places that were restricted to the location to the local population, but also by manipulating bodies and objects that should not be removed or touched, less extracted from their territory. According to Babitke and collaborators, exhaustion by the definition refers to the fact that more water is being extracted from the Salar de Atacama than can possibly be regenerated. They argue that the conditions of ecological exhaustion caused the extractive industry might be far more complex than this apparently simple equation indicates. For Atacamenos people, exhaustion can be extended to the impact of their social, political, and cultural lives. We wonder if we could apply the concept of exhaustion to the colonizer effects of funerary archaeology and the study of indigenous bodies without consent in the Atacamenos territory, since its impact in the culture and life of the Atacamenos people continue to be contested to this day. For this reason, the accompaniment of indigenous struggles to retain the relationship with their ancestors is also a struggle for the decolonization of archaeology practice and the repair and healing of the colonial wound. Thank you.
Gracias, Patricia. Thank you to you both. And what I'd like to do now is maybe as a first round of question is to have an opportunity for both of you to expand a little bit from your own experiences, right? Based on sort of the ideas and frameworks that you've already expressed. I was particularly struck by the role of history in both of your presentations, right? And how things have changed over times and how they have developed and how much of that development of the indigenous struggle has also been in some ways in relationship, in complicity, or sometimes on the contrary, in outright fight with or discipline of anthropology and as anthropologists. So I was wondering if both of you could sort of expand a little bit on those different elements, right? Particular experiences that you've had and of your own work And I think the real treat here is that you've worked for so long in these communities and have a real sense to look at this sort of historical development and see it over time. So maybe what are some of the lessons that you have learned over the years and decades that you think are really insightful and are really worth sharing with the broader anthropology community? And maybe we'll keep the same order, because I was really struck, Janet, by sort of you mentioning those particular cases, for example, already, the impact of that new constitution, right? And also the current state of affairs, which, you know, seems also incredibly depressing. But again, it would be really nice, sort of from your larger view, do you think some of the insights, experiences, and things you have learned that might be useful for us as part of the anthropology community to learn from?
It's complicated. It's a complicated question right now. You know, I would have liked to have been able to stop my talk right there at the moment of the Brazilian Constitution. As I say, it was an extremely optimistic time. And as everybody knows, there have been tremendous disappointments recently, which call into question how you know, the process of a step forward and two back becomes tiring after a while. One really has to think about strategies, and I think that's the main message. You know, Margaret Keck, Mimi Keck, has a very important book about international advocacy networks. And I think that as anthropologists, for the most part, we're finding ourselves in places where we can provide stepping stones to larger networks. I see that as a fundamental, almost obligation of anthropologists. I was fortunate to be working in Brazil, where anthropologists assume advocacy or activism rather than, for example, in the United States, where there's such tremendous animosity between the indigenous peoples and anthropologists. You know, I've been working, as you know, for 40 years. And so some of the people that I knew when they were 8 years old are now obviously 50. And it has been extremely rewarding, and we've all struggled together. We've gone through all of this together. And by together, I mean the Brazilian Anthropology Association, the North American Anthropologists, European Anthropologists, and Indigenous peoples. I really believe in the power of networks. You know, an example of it is the way in which Amnesty International works. So anthropologists are in a position of providing information, and knowing exactly where to provide that information to produce what result is an important part of anthropological practice. And so in all of the cases, I think, that I presented today, in the two cases, the role was to present information. So if information is what anthropologists do best, and if it's needed, there should be no contradiction in the role of anthropologists. And change and action.
Yeah, I think the operative word there is there should not be. Thank you, Janet. Patricia, I'm not sure if you want to answer in English or español, como quieras. Unmute.
I'll try first in English, and maybe I'll ask you to help me with my speech. First, I think something important to say is that the context where I work is in Chile. It has a very, it doesn't have a legal frame for that support indigenous rights in terms of their cultural patrimony. Because the actual law in Chile, the National Monument Law, claims the ownership of the indigenous patrimony. And starting with that problem, there is a very, very complicated to work in Chile with, for example, with the repatriation of human remains, because there is no law. There is no law that can support the indigenous claims. And in that context, I totally agree with Janet about the importance of international network advocacy, because in this context where we don't have legal frames that can help in terms of the repatriation or restitution of indigenous remains, the only thing we have been doing is trying to get the discussion about international laws very visible in terms of what is going on in the rest of the world about indigenous rights in terms of repatriation. Yeah, that is an important, very important fact. And I think in the world of repatriation, that is starting in Chile. The first repatriation was made in 2007. Since then, we have been working, connecting different indigenous communities with international networks. For example, the community, the Rapa Nui people in Easter Island, they have a strong process of connection with other networks, and also they are using a lot of international laws to set this topic as a valid topic and indigenous demand in Chile. Yeah, I'm working with the Atacamenos, and for example, the Atacamenos, when they have their first repatriation process in 2007, it was a process with the National Museum of American Indian, and in that context, the NACPRA law from United States helped to start this process, but in Chile there was no legal frame to do that, and the Monument Council office needed to work with that, no? Trying to use legal bodies from other countries to understand and allow this process to happen. Yeah.
Thank you. And I guess I'd like now to sort of push us a little bit further on the same line that you sort of both answered it in some ways, right? Which is what does that collaboration between anthropologists, right, that you were mentioning, Janet, that there shouldn't be a contradiction, right? What is that collaboration, right? What I think we identify as sort of a decolonial project, right? What does that decolonial project look like? And what does it look like from the global north, as you're saying, Patricia, where in some ways there are some institutionalized forms, right, and laws that allow you to fight in a different way, right? What does this decolonial project look like differently from the global north or the global south? Are those distinctions that important? And ultimately, I think it asks a bigger question about the decolonial project, which is really, in one sense, a decolonial project that is in solidarity with indigenous communities and indigenous peoples from throughout the Americas and throughout the globe, right? But there's also, I think, a separate element there, which has to do with the discipline of anthropology and the concern, right, of us as anthropologists, which is I would say, another question. I don't think it's bigger or broader, but a bigger question, which is, can anthropology actually be decolonized at all? But is that an absolute contradiction? Is that just another way to lie to ourselves, right? So if you could sort of I don't know if answer is the right question, but comment on that, right? On the first side, sort of what would a decolonial project in solidarity from the global north and or from the global south look like? And what implications would that have to the broader question of decolonizing the discipline? And is that really even possible? And well, either one. I don't know if you want to keep the same order or you want to go first, Patricia or Janet.
Well, one does what one can. You know, anthropologists don't have power, but they do have access to streams of power and to loci of power, oftentimes more than the marginalized peoples with whom we work. This is important because colonization is a process of imposing power over peoples that are not permitted to exert their own power. So whenever an anthropologist can enable, can change that, can do a bit of leveling, can provide power or provide access to it, I think it's extremely important. So for example, the international community has a set of instruments in place. I think Patricia is absolutely right that we do need laws, but they do not have to be followed as well. So there are certain instruments that people can call upon, such as ILO 169, for example, or the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or the Special Rapporteur, and so on. I think that, I'm sorry, I just got a note from someone. I think that creating liaisons, creating links to access is an important role for any outsider. An anthropologist happens to be that outsider. But if an anthropologist is being, is carrying out the job well, an anthropologist becomes, to the extent possible, a close member of the community. An anthropologist, you know, goes to weddings, goes to baptisms, goes to graduations and so on, and knows things that can be, as I say, useful in terms of obtaining rights. So for example, right now the Shavanchi are having runoff from soy farms that are adjacent to them. They require, in order to make their case hold, they require expertise, and they call on various kinds of expertise. Anthropology is a type of expertise, and when it can be helpful, I think it should be helpful. I think whether one enacts to decolonize is a question of one's politics and one's moral judgment. Perhaps not all anthropologists are concerned with this. I would hope they would be, but they may not be.
And I guess just to comment on that, right? Perhaps that's sort of a leadway, maybe, Patricia, right? That's particularly one of the difficulties that I've had of moving from studying anthropology in Ecuador to coming to study in the US, which you mentioned already, Janet, right? Where in Brazil and Latin America, sort of, you know, advocacy is assumed as part of the discipline, right? So it's not your politics, it's the discipline's politics, right? To come to the US, where, as you say, it's an option, right? And I think that says a lot about the regional differences, right? Again, going to this idea of the global north and global south, but I think it also says a lot about the discipline in itself, right? So I sort of wanted to sort of catch that distinction, which I think is part of the conversation. And Patricia, if you wanted to sort of answer sort of your sense of this decolonial project
Yeah.
and of the discipline itself.
Ok, Hugo, te voy a pedir que me traduzcas, por favor. Ahora me dio un poco de nervios. Bueno, para mí esta pregunta tiene que ver primero con cómo reflexionamos y recuperamos el lugar de la investigación como un espacio de lucha. ¿Ya? Me parece que es muy importante reflexionar y pensar en la investigación como un espacio de lucha entre los intereses y maneras de conocer el mundo de Occidente y los intereses y maneras de conocer el mundo de las poblaciones indígenas, y que también considerar que la investigación para las poblaciones indígenas puede ser un espacio de resistencia. ¿Ya?
So Patricia says that sort of for her, this question really entails a particular sense of how you understand what investigation is or what research is, of seeing it as a site of struggle, a site of contestation, right? And that one of the places you have to go is the first element, which is to think about what are the main objectives for the researchers and what are the main objectives for the communities. And they may actually not align. They might be very, very different. And for example, for the communities, many times it's a question of resistance, right? Is a sense of resisting the onslaught of the West. And for the research, many times is sort of contributing and being part of that Western idea of research.
Yeah. Y dentro de eso tomo las palabras, por ejemplo, de Linda Dwight Smith en términos de la investigación culturalmente sensible, ya que tiene que ver con un tipo de investigación en el cual los problemas y los asuntos que importan y para los cuales se necesita en la arqueología es lo que guía la orientación, ¿ya? Y en este contexto me parece, dentro de un proyecto como de descolonización de la disciplina, me parece muy importante empezar a cuestionar esta división entre investigador e investigado, ya que producto del proceso de colonización, el colonizado es el investigado, y en este caso el indígena es el investigado. Entonces me parece que es muy importante en nuestra disciplina empezar a cuestionar y quebrar esa dicotomía.
Voy a traducir, Patricia, si no lo hago completo, es decir, lo haces tú o me dices lo que falta, ¿no? And Patricia says she likes this quote very much, that sort of talks about the fact that the research or investigation should actually be culturally sensitive, and that it's actually those problems or those issues that actually are important culturally or to the community are the ones that should actually be the objective of the research. Particularly, for example, when you're doing archaeology, it's less about sort of coming in with the project and more about thinking of what are the values or the local values that people consider important that then demand sort of this archaeological research. But for this, there has to be a very strong sort of paradigmatic break between this dichotomy of the researcher and those that are actually studied. And the reason for that, because it's an important part of the decolonial project, that what you have is sort of the researcher embodying the role of the colonizer, and those that get studied are the colonized. So unless you start there at the very beginning of that sort of differentiation and dichotomization, you're actually not going to advance much more in the problem.
Mm-hmm. And la otra parte sería la importancia en estas investigaciones que tienen que ver con la descolonización, desde mi punto de vista, de soltar el control, porque como bien lo decía Janet hace un momento, uno de los problemas de la investigación es que los que tienen el control y la autoridad sobre las investigaciones somos los antropólogos, los arqueólogos, y los que están siendo investigados no tienen ese poder en la investigación en la forma como se hacía anteriormente, ¿no? Y bueno, quisiera un poco concluir con esta reflexión, también poniendo en la mesa para la discusión que creo que otro espacio para la descolonización de la disciplina tiene que ver con recobrar el involucramiento, que creo que es algo que se ha perdido mucho, porque desde esta visión como disciplinaria de objetividad se ha tomado como una base de la disciplina arqueológica o antropológica la distancia, ¿no? Que la distancia es necesaria. Y creo que para descolonizar la arqueología y la antropología, parafraseando a Karina Joffre, activista indígena huarpe, hay que dejarse atravesar y recuperar la sensibilidad en la investigación. O sea, solo a través de recuperar esta sensibilidad y la vulnerabilidad y comprometernos con las luchas políticas y sociales de los grupos con los que estamos trabajando, podemos caminar desde mi punto de vista hacia ese, yo no lo veo como un fin último, la descolonización, sino más bien como un proceso. Porque creo, bueno, respondiendo a tu otra pregunta, me parece que la descolonización en sí sería como desandar toda la historia que ya hemos vivenciado y desarmar todo el proceso histórico. Pero a lo que sí podemos apuntar como antropólogos y arqueólogos es a este proceso, a cómo a través de este proceso nosotros podemos ir cambiando estas lógicas de la disciplina, ¿no?
De nuevo, me ayudas particularmente con el medio segundo si me falta algo. So to conclude her answer to this question, she thinks there's at least 3 elements to consider. The first one is that the sort of dividing this dichotomy or breaking up this dichotomy between the researcher and the subject of study is particularly hard because it actually means giving up your control or giving up your power or giving up your authority. So that really is the main problem, right? And this is something, Janet, she says that you mentioned already about the authority, right? That, you know, even though we don't have a lot of power, when we come into these communities, we have more power and more authority for them, right? And then in the sense, and the second part of the answer was that she thinks what's missing is what she was referring to as involucramiento, which is some sort of involvement or participation, right? And she was quoting an indigenous scholar from South America, Karina Joffre, who sort of talks about allowing yourself to be sort of atravesado, to be actually sort of traversed, right? Crossed by the research or the problem or the cultural sensitive issues of the place where you are and what you're being involved. And that unless you allow yourself to be transversed or crossed by this reality that allows you to have a greater level of cultural sensitivity, you really are not going to be able to do much more than sort of repeat that colonial or neo-colonial process, right? The decolonial project won't actually sort of be able to develop or blossom, right? And then to sort of conclude that she doesn't think that the decolonial project is actually anything other than a process, right? Because this idea that you can sort of like revert colonialism or revert centuries of colonization, right, is a fallacy, is impossible, it's a fantasy. So that it's really not about sort of reversing a colonial process that's already occurred, but quite the contrary, to sort of continue a process of trying to rework that. So it's less about an endpoint. It's about it's less about reaching a particular conclusion or sort of final, like, you know, place that you reach, but actually more sort of it being an unending, ongoing, continuing process.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Janet, I don't know if you wanted to add something to this as we were talking.
Yes, I was recalling the recent literature on racism in the United States. And I think an interesting distinction has been made between non-racism and anti-racism. And I think that's perhaps maybe a simplistic, but a convenient way to perhaps summarize some of the very interesting points that Patricia, and important points that Patricia made.
Yeah, and now we're going to start taking questions from the audience. So I'll sort of buffer them and sort of introduce them. But I think your point is perfect for that, Janet, right? Because it's not sort of a struggle by indigenous communities or for indigenous rights that is some way isolated to global issues of all kinds and all over the world, right? And I think the distinction you're talking about, sort of racism and anti-racism movement or ideologies, speaks to that point and the connectedness of all of this, right? So, so the first question I want to share is actually in the chat, actually, and it's for you, Patricia, if you want to look at it, right? And it asks if you can talk a little bit about the reactions of Chilean academics, museum professionals, and government agencies to the concerns and questions about repatriation. Yeah.
Bueno, las reacciones en el ámbito. I'm gonna need your help again, Hugo. I'll try. The reactions in the archaeological anthropological field in Chile are mostly, until now, of surprise, and it's a strong conflict in Chile. The repatriation and restitution problem and all the rights that involve indigenous peoples there are not still recognized by the academic world in Chile. The codes of ethics for the Archaeological Society, they don't consider any subject related with indigenous rights. And in that way, I think in my context, one of the most important activism for me is to visualize and spoke about these issues in the Chilean archaeological and anthropological field of societies. That is one of the first works that all of the researchers who are working with repatriation, restitution, that we are not so much. That is one of our first fields of struggle of activism. And for the state of Chile is also a difficult matter, because until now, probably there had been probably, if I'm not mistaken, probably 8 repatriation processes in Chile. There are not so many, but for each process, the state in Chile is taking a specific research and working with guidelines, but not with any law. And we are way far of having any law related to indigenous patrimony, because right now is a discussion about a new national monument law in Chile, and this the discussion of this law is not considering the participation of the indigenous communities. That means that the next or the more modern heritage law that we're going to have is not considering the participation of indigenous people either. And for me, that is a very kind of depressing context, because if the heritage law is still saying that the bodies and the indigenous patrimony is owned by the state, when we're going to be able to talk about repatriation?
So let me use that to actually ask a follow-up question, and then we have another question from the audience. But let me follow up first, and it really is this question of heritage and also the Constitution, right? Because Chile just voted to write a new constitution, and if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying there'll be very little indigenous participation in that. I may be wrong. So no. Just right. Well, yeah. If you want to answer that part.
It's not in the Constitution. Yes, they are discussing the Constitution, and they are hoping that it's going to be an important indigenous participation in that. But I am talking about a heritage law that has been discussed in the last years, that is not considering indigenous participation.
Right. So my broader question, and maybe Janet, you can sort of, is like, first is sort of at the constitutional level. And when you were talking about that new constitution in Brazil in 1988 as sort of being a very successful moment of collaboration or participation of indigenous communities in it. So one, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. But second, I was trying to connect it to that heritage law, right? And also if both of you can talk a little bit, sort of maybe how in Latin America we still sort of have an idea of heritage as a very sort of almost idea of private property, right? Or public property, but property nonetheless, right? And particularly the idea of the indigenous bodies and remains as being part of that heritage as well. So if maybe you could start off, Janet, talking a little bit about that constitution in Brazil and also ideas of heritage and maybe how they have or have not changed over time, both in Brazil and in Chile.
Well, of course, the Constitution is only aspirational and it must be turned into laws and tested in the courts. And that is what has been going on since the Constitution appeared in 1988. So that is 32 years, is it not? In which these things have been fought over. I do believe that this very fight is an enactment of colonization or decolonization. And the problem is that there will always be both. The problem is that they're always in struggle. And we find ourselves in a framework in which it almost has no meaning because it's everywhere. So I think that, as Patricia said, colonization is a process, but as such, I think it's not a discrete phenomenon. And I think it must be broken up in order for us to better understand. When it comes to law, that does provide a basis for argumentation. The law becomes a commonality, it becomes a resource for authority. And yet you find yourself finding people in leadership positions, as in state leaders, who disregard law. What can be done then? This is a major problem. But two, the law itself is not homogeneous. In Brazil, you have fascinating disputes within the law, within jurisdictions, over, as we do here in the United States, between what is called in Brazil the general prosecutor. He acts as a kind of public defender, and the role of the prosecutor is to defend society. It's that abstract. But insofar as the prosecutor defends society, it's the very prosecutor that interprets the Constitution with the protection of the citizens of the country in mind. So in Brazil, we see a number of things that have been literally bouncing in the courts, from the Supreme Court to the lower courts and back to the Supreme Court. This was the case of Belo Monte, as you probably know, and finally it passed, in spite of the fact that it went through numerous years in which it was considered to be illegal and thrown out as if that were permanent, but it wasn't. So my point really is that colonialism comprises all of these things, and one must find a way in to handle it, to turn it into, to see where colonialism is in practice and address those places.
Good. Patricia?
Ahora sí te voy a pedir de nuevo tu ayuda.
Okay. Good.
Bueno, creo que en Sudamérica, en términos de heritage, de patrimonio, el mismo concepto de patrimonio está siendo contestado por intelectuales y activistas indígenas y también por investigadores. Entonces hay un fuerte estudio, ¿ya? Y a la vez proceso de activismo que va a cuestionar este concepto, ¿no? Y cuestionar el vínculo entre la patrimonialización, el extractivismo, y cómo eso se puede ver también desde una perspectiva de neocolonización. Entonces, independiente de que tenemos cuerpos legales bastante, en el caso de Chile, bastante débiles respecto al tema del patrimonio indígena, por ejemplo, tenemos el caso de Argentina, que sí tiene leyes para la restitución de cuerpos humanos, que también son criticadas por el activismo indígena en algunos contextos, ¿ya? Pero creo que, y me gustaría visibilizar, que en Sudamérica hay una fuerte discusión respecto a la fuerza y los efectos que tienen los procesos patrimonializadores en nuestras sociedades y en la sociedad indígena en particular. Y por ejemplo, se cuestiona mucho el proyecto Capajñán.
Let me stop you there, and then you can remember Capagnan, right? Patricia is answering sort of more the heritage part of the question, and saying that in Latin America, you really have a sort of more recent new group of contestation of what heritage means, particularly from indigenous leaders, indigenous communities, but also researchers as well, and that they're actually questioning the idea of heritage or heritage making and sort of linking it with sort of forces of extractivism, and sort of seeing both as sort of both as neocolonial projects or neocolonial attempts, right? So that even though the laws are in terms of repatriation, for example, are very weak in Chile, that's not the case throughout South America, and we can see that from the presentation of Janet in Brazil as well. But for example, Argentina has very sort of stronger laws about the returning of indigenous bodies, and has stronger laws in terms of repatriation, but very, very much sort of thinking that even those laws are being sort of protested by some indigenous communities, that all of them are once again projects that are complicit in this neo-colonial project. And she was about to start talking about another one on the Capagnan, and particularly the UNESCO, I would imagine, investment in the Capagnan project in South America.
En Sudamérica hay un proceso muy fuerte de contestación y crítica, de nuevo, ¿no? Desde investigadores y también de comunidades indígenas al Capagnan, ya que se ve como un proyecto también en el que estaría vinculado con un proyecto de patrimonialización y un proyecto neocolonialista en el cual se está imponiendo una visión y una forma de concebir el patrimonio sobre las comunidades que de alguna forma, y esto ha sido planteado también por miembros de comunidades, puede tener efectos en el control del patrimonio de esas comunidades que estarían involucradas en el Capajñán. Recién hace unos días hubo un encuentro en el que diferentes investigadores y activistas hablaron sobre los problemas y las problemáticas del Capajñán en Sudamérica, con las que comparto, ¿no?
So for example, when you look at this particular project of the Capagnan that's being done throughout the Andes, which is the Inca Road, and what you see are sort of kind of two sides to the picture. On the one side, the indigenous communities and indigenous leaders that, along with researchers, are sort of in contestation and questioning these ideas of heritage and how the Capagnan is actually being sort of recuperated or being recovered. And then on the other side, you have this more sort of hegemonic official view of what heritage is, which tends to be sort of more powerful and more monolithic, right? And what you have is a conflict that's sort of being expressed in projects like the Capagnan, which is really at some point more about a question of power and control and authority. So that it's really about sort of heritage or these historical remains being used to argue over sort of control over them. And that's what you actually see happening with the Capagnan. And of course, it's having the most difficult or negative or harsh effects on the indigenous communities themselves. See?
Sí.
Okay. So we actually have two questions in the chat already, and there are many more. So let me share them and see if we can entertain them and answer them. And the first one is actually a combination of two, which have to do with what we've already mentioned, which is sort of this difference about the commitment or advocacy that we see ourselves taking in anthropology. So the first one is very specific, but I'm going to combine it with another one, right? And the first one asks, quote, where do you draw a line between being a student learning about a culture and activism to change it? So I'm going to read that. It's a direct quote, right? Quote, where do we draw a line between being a student learning about a culture and activism to change it, unquote, right? But I sort of want to combine this one, right? And I'll read it again. It's easier for me just to read it than to try to paraphrase this, right? Which is, what are your thoughts regarding the challenges of working as activist anthropologists, archaeologists within the context of academia? Certainly we can write academically about our activism, but also have to juggle because we may have other areas of interest. How might academic institutions value the bipolar anthropologist, archaeologist, unquote, right? So I think both questions are really getting to at least one of the issues that you I've already sort of touched upon, right? Which is this conflict between an anthropologist that is committed and to the community and an activist, and one that is somehow more academic, right? So how would you address that?
Bueno, yo creo que es un conflicto que va a estar presente constantemente, ¿no? Es un conflicto que tiene que ver con el posicionamiento, desde dónde quieres tú realizar tu práctica, hasta dónde quieres tú ser atravesado o hasta dónde quieres tú dejarte sensibilizar o vulnerabilizar por el contexto en el que estás trabajando. Yeah.
Deja traducir eso, right? So for Patricia, this is a conflict that will exist for a very long time, and that it has to do with your positionality and where you position yourself. Where do you want to position yourself? Where do you want to start from? And how much do you want to allow yourself to be crossed and become more culturally sensitive and approachable or not?
Creo que, o sea, es siempre importante, así como consideramos la ética situacional de dónde estamos investigando, hay siempre una ética personal, y es con esa ética con la que uno tiene que lidiar. Yo no puedo decirle a otro antropólogo qué tipo de antropología o arqueología quiere hacer. Yo puedo hablar desde el espacio de la arqueología o la antropología con la que yo creo. Y la arqueología que yo creo y con la que yo me alineo es la arqueología comprometida, es una arqueología que es de activismo. Para mí, el hacer arqueología se relaciona con que lo que yo hago les sirva a las comunidades con las que trabajo. Y en ese contexto, soltar el poder y el control de la investigación. Y por eso, visibilizar el rol del investigador como facilitador.
So Patricia is emphasizing not only sort of the situational ethics, which would be an issue of positionality, but above all, it's a question of the personal, right? It's a personal question of what do you want to do? And she's very much committed to the idea of an activist anthropologist, an activist archaeology, but she's very clear that she doesn't feel compelled to tell other anthropologists of how they should act or what they should think or behave or what they should do, but that she very much personally is invested in the idea that the archaeology must serve or help the community that they're working with, that the archaeology's goal is to actually do work that is actually going to be in service of the community that they're working in. And in that sense, her goal is to really let go of the control or power, however little it might be, that anthropologists would then have in that community.
And in that context, visualize the role of facilitator more than investigator.
Janet?
Yes, I think there are parallel processes going on in archaeology and in cultural anthropology right now, in which anthropologists are moving toward facilitating rather than controlling. In Brazil, for example, there's a new generation of indigenous anthropologists who are following the academic structures in writing of criticizing their forebears. And so that's going to be a struggle over control of knowledge. And it should be very interesting to watch.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question. And again, I'm going to read the question, then read sort of the comment that sustains the question. But the question is, quote, how do we balance localized knowledge and specific objectives in the legal frameworks glossed with the term indigenous? And again, I'll repeat that. How do we balance localized knowledge and specific objectives in the legal frameworks glossed with the term indigenous, unquote? And this is the context in which they're asking the question. The Maya Leader Alliance in Southern Belize, the first one in the world to use UNDRIP, after their land rights victory in the Caribbean High Court of Appeals, is writing legislation in collaboration with local and international community members and legal experts. This will run parallel to national legislation. They could both provide and benefit from this kind of collaboration. Last year, they called anthropologists to an Abink to meet with Maya leaders. I think the solidarity is led, or should be, by indigenous communities, in my opinion. They invite us to access or power at their discretion. And that's where the question comes in, right? How do we balance localized knowledge and specific objectives in the legal frameworks glossed with the term indigenous?
Can you repeat the last part? In the legal frameworks?
Glossed with the term indigenous, right?
Lost. Oh, glossed or lost?
Glossed.
Glossed.
Yeah, Gloss.
Y eso lo puedes traducir, Hugo. La pregunta es cómo se balancea, o sea, cómo
¿Cómo balanceas objetivos locales específicos dentro de una estructura legal que se define o determina como indígena? So I guess the sort of the real element that's being added here, right? When does this go beyond just simply an option from the anthropologist and the legal framework that gets invested at local, regional, and national level?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the choice of a term is a political one. And in part, that's because it either provides access or not to instruments. In this case, possibly law. I'm not familiar with Guatemalan or Mexican law pertaining to indigenous peoples. But at the international level, the term indigenous does very carefully lay out some rights, and it links to the Office of Minorities and so on. And there are some guarantees for groups in those statuses. In that sense, the word indigenous can be used as an instrument in and of itself. I'm not sure if the question is truth or not. It seems to me that indigenous is better than many terms because it refers to the originality, which is the important issue, much like the First Nations have chosen to call themselves First Nations for that very reason.
Mhm. Absolutely.
The term people is also contested. This is a matter of sovereignty, isn't it?
But also, well, yeah, sorry.
Indigenous should refer to a kind of sovereignty, but of course, in the colonial context in which we live, it doesn't. And that's the basis of a very serious debate.
Yeah, and what I was going to add to that, right, that it's an issue of sovereignty, and therefore it's also an issue of authority and power, right? And,
Yeah.
and a little bit of what I was sort of talking at the very beginning of, you know, where does the authoritative power come from? And in particular, or nation state societies, legal frameworks actually afford those kinds of authoritative power. And they might be great, right, at a particular moment, in a specific moment in time, but then they also in some ways sort of become prisons after a while, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And that's also an issue in the question, right? How do we participate in this and yet at the same time know that it can become monolithic and very sort of in like a prison more than liberating later on.
Yeah.
Patricia, I'm not sure if you want to add something.
No, I totally agree with Janet about the how the concept of indigenous can be instrumental in terms of international laws, and it can help a lot in the indigenous rights of local communities. But at the same time, as I was thinking that the very concept of indigenous is being contested for some local communities. For example, thinking about the Peruvian indigenous, what we call indigenous communities, they don't want to be called indigenous, no, and it depends on the context. And I think Franz Salomon described indigenous communities that they want to be called peasant, not indigenous, and I think that is something important, no? And if you are working with communities, you have to respect that as well. The point is not going and imposing things, but at the same time, if you consider the international legal frames, that can be useful. And there is a fine line between intervention and collaboration in some topics.
Absolutely. And there's a lot that springs there. For example, a colleague and I are doing work on the Ecuadorian coast, and particularly in a community called Engabao. And a lot of the members of the community sort of recognize their ancestral legacy, particularly their sexual ancestral legacy, right? And so they're claiming, right, particular concepts and names like the enchaquirados, which is a term that was used since pre-colonial and colonial times to recognize their transgender existence, right? But this is not done in a vacuum, right? And it's done in particular contemporary definitions of that term, but also particular sort of differences between rural and urban communities. So again, as an anthropologist, we participate in that process. We don't, right, by any means control it, but at the same time, we are complicit to that process. And I think you're right, Janet, that it brings interesting questions, no longer just for archaeologists, but also for cultural anthropologists that find themselves complicit in these processes that at the very best have to do, I think, with ethnogenesis, right? And new forms of new old forms of identification, I would say. We have one last question. which I think is also true in the Ecuadorian context, which is this idea of what happens to the indigenous communities when they enter into negotiation with local, regional, and national authorities, right? Which is what the legal framework questions kind of brought up. In the sense of when the state enters into negotiation with indigenous communities, one of the things that happens is that it creates greater level of inequality within those communities, right? And for example, in Ecuador, you could see it with the CONAIE, that immediately as it rose to power, it also were sort of the indigenous men and Quechua speaking and the ones that had gone and gotten degrees, right, university degrees, that all of a sudden became the leaders of the community. So in some ways, they entered into negotiation with the state, but they also created greater or different forms of inequality within the community, right? So the question is really asking, what about those greater forms of inequality that happens within the indigenous communities? And what does that mean in terms of coalition? In terms of coalition with other indigenous groups, but above all with other oppressed groups, particularly, for example, Afro communities throughout, right? Because it actually, right, as both of you recognizing, the term indigenous becomes heavily politicized. And if it's going to get some advantages, then it immediately means something to some people in opposition to others. So from your experiences, what has been occurring in terms of that greater level of inequality within the different indigenous movements, and then in terms of a vertical relationship with other oppressed communities, particularly Afro communities, but also I would say communities that have to do with sexual rights as well. So. I thought we'd have an easy question to end.
This is a very big problem.
Yeah, I mean, and it's something that CONAIE has been very, very explicit about. And I think the fact that they are the CONAIE, that they don't sort of see themselves as one, but a confederation, has allowed them to actually deal with this problem. But they're very explicit about it being a problem, right? That there being this sort of constant consultation and breakage of greater forms of inequality within the groups themselves.
Sí, yo creo que sin duda es un proceso que se ve en otras comunidades, como por ejemplo en el norte de Chile, no solo el hecho de que algunas comunidades, en el caso atacameño, han negociado no solo con el Estado, sino también con las empresas mineras para acceder a ciertos recursos, porque tampoco ven que estas empresas se vayan a ir, ¿no? O sea, considerando el contexto político y legal, las leyes de minería están sobre la ley indígena, entonces no hay como opción de sacarlas, les van a seguir sacando el agua, entonces ya ante este mal que ya está presente, se han abierto a negociar y eso sin duda ha generado diferencias y divisiones al interior de las comunidades, entre aquellas que se oponen o grupos de indígenas o líderes que se oponen y aquellos que no. E incluso el ingreso de los atacameños ya hace más de 20 años al turismo ha generado una serie de desigualdades sociales y diferencias en términos de sus luchas, ¿no? Porque el acceso de unos a lo que es la industria del turismo los pone en una posición muy desventajosa con otros atacameños y bueno, y el acceso de otras transnacionales y también de otras empresas nacionales que realmente han arrasado con el territorio.
So, Patricia's saying she definitely sees this in the Atacamenos community, and not even only or exclusively at the negotiations of the community at state level, but actually with mining companies and members of the Atacamenos community that sort of understand that the mining companies are not going to go away, and that within the political and legal context, rather than just being against them and just hoping that they would go away, they've entered into negotiations with them. And particularly because the sort of mining laws are actually above the indigenous laws or legislation, right? So this has definitely created conflict within the community themselves between those that are in active resistance and simply want the mining companies to be removed from the territory, as opposed to others that enter into negotiation. And this is something that's not new. This is something that's also happened from before, particularly with the tourist industry, when once again, it had a very uneven effect on the people that participated in the industry, with one of them sort of benefiting more from it than others, and others just simply not wanting to participate in it at all.
Yeah, Brazil is now looking at the prospects of allowing mining on indigenous territories. This is a project law, a bill put forth by Bolsonaro. And since about 1996, mining companies have been putting in claims so that almost all of the indigenous areas are covered with claims, with mining claims. And these could then be allowed to actually advance toward exploitation if this bill were passed. Since 1996, they've simply been languishing and waiting for something like this, some assistance of the kind that Bolsonaro offers. I think Jerry's point is really very important. That we must think in terms of the bigger picture. We must not stop at ethnicities or race or named groups. We really must look at the intersectionality and look at the power imbalances everywhere. And of course, mining is a major thing. In the Kayapo areas, people are divided. In the northwestern portion of the Kayapo area, the indigenous peoples have turned down a very large compensation that they might have accepted. Whereas elsewhere in the Kayapo territory, people are accepting this very tempting compensation. This is the kind of thing that captures the insidious ways in which these powerful entities will continue to try to exploit and reap whatever they can from these lands. So the so-called colonization, which, as I said, is a complex of many different things, has taken this newest form. And for the moment, it's looking extremely dangerous. One way in which anthropologists can be of use is, again, in the business of information. It has always seemed to me that when I watch a mining company begin to court a group of people whose land it would like to access, the people may not have access to the kind of information that they would need to make this choice. They don't have the history of what has happened in the past elsewhere where mining companies have come in. So an anthropologist, once again, if an anthropologist wants to play the role of a liaison, could connect. For example, wouldn't it be an interesting scenario to think of South American indigenous peoples horizontally connecting across the continent, or vertically connecting to North American indigenous peoples vis-a-vis mining companies. Now, this is such a serious endeavor. One has to look at Canada to see that Chevron and Texaco, which are Canadian companies, Vale, which is Vale do Rio Doce, which is a Canadian company, is in a nation in which the political strength of the indigenous peoples is probably much more powerful than it is anywhere in Latin America. And yet these oil companies are still sort of having their way. This must be addressed in ways that it hasn't been before, and perhaps the new information technologies and the new communication technologies will enable it. I can only hope so.
Mhm.
But I do agree with Jerry that one must not stop at anything less than, fighting inequalities wherever they exist.
I think, and I would like to add that in the case of the Atacamenos, there have been some works between archaeologists and anthropologists and geographers and ecologists who are helping indigenous communities with their claims against mining, or for example, with this big problem about the water and how much the mining companies want to extract more and more water. They, with a participatory archaeology, using participatory maps, they mapped all how the water was producing, and Fernanda Kalasic made a very nice and interesting work about that. And I think those kind of research can help very much in the struggles of indigenous people and mining industries in everywhere. I really think our disciplines can help in the indigenous struggles.
So
Yes, this is an area where we really need international networks to focus their energies.
Yeah.
and on that hopeful note, we will end, and I want to give the word to Uzma, but I also want to extend my thank you to you both, Patricia and Janet. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Patricia and Janet, for this remarkable conversation, and Hugo for shepherding it so thoughtfully. This conversation made me think through the relationship between activist work. Like, I'm just kind of processing everything that I heard and kind of thinking through what I'm taking with myself. This relationship between activist work and work that intentionally frames itself as decolonial, and the fact that there are distinctions between the ways that anthropology in some spaces of the global South has a certain activist assumption as compared to US anthropology, where being political seems to be optional as best. I mean, that really stood out to me as a key point to kind of think through. I keep thinking about what it means to think about or contextualize research and study always as a site of struggle. I found that to be quite a remarkable way of thinking through this. For the communities, it's always about resistance, right? Resisting the research of the West. What does it mean to resist the West? What are the sources of power? What does it mean to think of decolonization as a process, right? Not just as a transfer or a shift, but what is the process of decolonization? And is there a way we can all be facilitators rather than investigators? I think these questions really set us up with a lot of material to kind of think through. Like, what does it mean to resist English? अब इसके बारे में अब और क्या कहेंगे हम लोग? बहुत सारी बातें हैं जिसके लिए कभी और मिलेंगे, you know? So much to say about this, and perhaps for another time, just do a quick translation, right? But for now, please join me in thanking Janet, Patricia, and Hugo for providing such a rich and generative space within which we may consider these same questions and these issues. And to all of you viewing this, thank you for joining us for this webinar presentation by the Anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences. Our next event is on January 25th, 2021. It's gonna be better than this year. Dr. Shalini Shankar will be speaking on decolonizing anthropology, linguistic, anthropological perspectives. This talk will be followed by a discussant comments delivered by Dr. Graham Jones. So I hope you'll all be able to join us for that important talk and discussion as well. Once again, thank you to both Professors Janet Chernela and Patricia Ayala and Hugo Benavides, and to all of you who have attended this from all across the globe. Be well and be safe. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
Thanks,
you
Susan.
also. Thank you all.
Thank you to all.